I was raised to believe that the Bible defines good and evil for us within its pages. But when we stop and examine this idea using the Bible, we discover something else. In the Garden of Eden, there were two trees, a tree that would bring life to all who ate of its fruit, and a tree that brought death. And it was the second tree, the tree that resulted in death, that contained the knowledge of good and evil. Have we been deceived by the serpent who is trying to get us to eat of this second tree? Is the Bible really trying to define good and evil for us? Let's take a step back. Let's run an experiment. Instead of seeking to define good and evil, let's instead ask the question of the trees. Let's attempt to define life and death, but to do so, we must first seek it out. So join us as we Derish Chai, as we seek life. Hey everybody, welcome to the Derish Chai Experiment, the show where we explore how the Bible is unified from front to back in theology and the expectations that are placed on man. Well, 40 years ago in the text that we're in today, Israel was commanded to take the land of Canaan. Before they did so, the people asked to send some men before them to scout the land to discover what it held, and God allowed it. Upon their return from Canaan, these scouts turned spies, reported that the land was indeed a bountiful land and full of good fruit, but this land was occupied by an enemy that was great in size and power. At this report, the people who had been commanded to move and take up the inheritance, they trembled and they feared, and they thought little of God's promise and God's power to deliver on his promise, especially when his delivery of that promise depended on them and their weakness. And when achieving that promise might mean their lives and the lives of all of their families or friends. And so accusations were made. God is not really for us. He wants us to die. We should just go back to Egypt and live comfortably there. Because Egypt was familiar. Egypt was known, and the limits of the power and the willingness to exercise that power was a known factor. There was comfort to be found in Egypt, even if that comfort was in the midst of slavery, without a moment of rest. Even if their children were being taken captive and destroyed. Even if assimilation into the culture was unavoidable in the long term. At least it wasn't warfare against giants and certain death. Egypt was better than the hardship of warfare. Egypt was better than this unknown and unexperienced promise. In the face of this, two men stood their ground and encouraged the others. But God does want us to succeed. He does want to bless us with his inheritance that he has prepared for us. He wants us to do more than simply survive in a culture steeped in death. He wants more for us than never-ending labor. He wants more for us than a bare subsistence life taking scraps from the table of our enemies. He wants us to thrive and grow and be fruitful. And we have a secret weapon at our disposal. We have the God who destroyed Egypt on our side. With God on our side, we have no option but to succeed, was their cry. But the fear of the unknown and the fear of the enemy, coupled with the call of the familiarity of Egypt, was too great. And so the people stood up and threatened to destroy those who would dare to push them to do the fearful and uncomfortable thing. And because of this, the promise was delayed. Because the people saw the unknown, and they saw the enemy in the way, and thought that it was better to just remain fruitless and comfortable and return to the prison that they knew. After all, someone could get hurt out there in the battle. Giants are scary and powerful, and this enemy is entrenched. But in Egypt, at least Pharaoh acted as a protector, and they were the most powerful nation on earth. No thought, though, was given to the guarantee of harm that was present and remaining in the world. No thought of the lack of the future that was present in Egypt. No thought of the fact that it was their own cries that ascended to heaven that God had answered to free them. Their only considerations were their fear of the enemy and their pursuit of comfort. And with this, the decision was made. The people would not inherit the promise. Because of their own will first. Their lack of faith and their lack of obedience, their lack of courage to step into the difficult and the unknown, an attitude that did not fully pass away, as we saw last week. And because of God's will second, as he then punished the generation that rejected the promise of Canaan. And that first generation passed away, and a new generation was raised up in its place. And the new man of this new generation had grown up, seeing God work and provide for them, witnessing him provide ways when there was no other way, and living completely reliant upon him for everything. They had experienced victories that were incredible, such as taking out several kings before they even got to the land without a single casualty. They had seen miracles and had eaten every day directly from the table of God. They had never experienced Egypt and the false promise of comfort and safety. Their only hope was to inherit the land. This new generation had left behind the carnal and had only ever known the spiritual, because they were in a desert where the flesh was stripped away. Their daily bread was spiritual bread. Their daily drink was spiritual drink, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 10. Living in this way had created a foundation for the faith necessary to now take on the fearful enemy in pursuit of the promise that God had in store for them, to enter into the fearful, unknown, and inherit the promise. And at this point, Israel has finally succeeded where their parents failed. The land is theirs, for the most part. The promise has been achieved. And two men from that first generation who had spent their lives in the wilderness alongside these children are on the cusp of receiving the reward that they had been promised so long ago. So let's read this chapter, and let's talk about what we can learn from Caleb's faith and the strength and courage that he exhibits in this chapter. Joshua chapter 14. Now these, the children of Israel, inherited in the land of Canaan, which Eleazar the priest and Joshua the son of Nun and the heads of the fathers of the tribes of the children of Israel caused them to inheritance. Their inheritance was by lot, as Adonai had commanded by the hand of Moses, for the 9 tribes and the half-tribe. For Moses had given the inheritance of the 2 tribes and the half-tribe beyond the Jordan, but to the Levites he gave no inheritance in their midst. For the children of Joseph had become 2 tribes, Manasseh and Ephraim, and they gave no part to the Levites in the land except cities to dwell in, with their open land for their livestock and their possessions, as Adonai had commanded Moses, so the children of Israel did, and they divided the land. And the children of Judah came to Joshua in Gilgal, and Caleb son of Jephunneh the Kenizzite said to him, You know the word which Adonai said to Moses the man of God concerning you and me in Kadesh Barnea. I was 40 years old when Moses, the servant of Adonai, sent me from Kadesh Barnea to spy out the land, and I brought back word to him as it was in my heart. But my brothers who went up with me made the heart of the people melt, but I followed Adonai my God completely. So Moses swore on that day, saying, The land on which your foot has trodden is your inheritance and your children's forever, because you have followed Adonai my God completely. And now see, Adonai has kept me alive, as he said, these 45 years since Adonai spoke this word to Moses, while Israel walked in the wilderness. And now see, I am 85 years old today, yet I am still as strong today as I was on the day that Moses sent me. As my strength was then, so my strength is now for battle, and for going out and for coming in. And now give me this mountain of which Adonai spoke in that day, for you heard in that day how the Anakim were there, and that the cities were great and walled. If Adonai is with me, then I shall dispossess them, as Adonai said. And Joshua then blessed him and gave Hebron to Caleb the son of Jephunneh as an inheritance. So Hebron became the inheritance of Caleb the son of Jephunneh, the Kenizzite, to this day, because he followed Adonai, God of Israel, completely. Now the name of Hebron was formerly Kiriath-Arbah. Arbah was the greatest man among the Anakim, and the land had rest from fighting. Joshua and Caleb, 2 men of faith, the 2 scouts who believed in the power of God to deliver Canaan into the hands of Israel. 2 men who stood in the face of a mob intent on their death and would not back down. God can deliver this land into our hands, they had declared. He has promised to do so, and he has been faithful in his promises. These men were rewarded for the faith that they had exhibited in the previous generation. But it's a common misconception that Joshua and Caleb were the only 2 people from the previous generation who are allowed to enter the land. This is a false conception that's based solely on what the Bible seems to say explicitly. For example, Numbers 15:30, No one shall come into the land where I swore that I would make you dwell, except Caleb, the son of Jephunneh, and Joshua, the son of Nun. See, only Joshua and Caleb would enter into the land. except there's a limit on who the word you is referring to in that previous verse. Let's go back one verse to Numbers 15:29. Your dead bodies shall fall in this wilderness, and of all your number listed in the census from 20 years old and upward who have grumbled against me. Only the bodies of those who were numbered in the census at the beginning of the book of Numbers were to be part of this judgment. But there was an entire tribe that was not part of that census, which had just been explored in the last chapter and is spoken of again in this chapter in verse 4. And so while this chapter does focus on Joshua and Caleb as the heroes of the previous generation who were rewarded greatly for their faith, it does also mention at least one other who was alive at the time of the incident with the spies. This is none other than Eleazar, the priest, in verse 1. If you look back, Eleazar was initiated as a priest and is mentioned by name as far back as Exodus chapter 6. He is also mentioned in Exodus 28 in regards to the priest's garments, and in Leviticus 10 as one of the two surviving sons of Aaron after the death of Nadab and Abihu. All of these events occurred long before the spies were sent into the land in Numbers 13, which means that Eleazar was not part of the judgment of the death of the first generation. And this would lead us to assume that all Levites were not included in this judgment because the Levites were not represented in the scouting mission, and the Levites were not represented in the census. But Eleazar, this trustworthy and reliable servant of God, he serves as a background character for much of the Torah, since he doesn't seem to rock the boat in any meaningful way. He is chosen to serve as a priest, and he fulfills his duty to the point where his son is raised properly in the holiness of God and his people. Remember, it was Phinehas, the son of Eleazar, that killed Zimri and Cosbi when they engaged in fornication within the site of the tabernacle. But because no stories of great renown or acts of mighty piety are told of Eleazar, he is often forgotten and relegated to the dustbin of history. But Eleazar's story is one of faithful and consistent obedience lived out in the service to God. No, he never killed anyone, and no, he did not face giants or go to war. He did enable the worship of Adonai as the high priest once his father Aaron died. Because of this, I'd like to make sure that we recognize Eleazar as a hero of the Torah, an oversight that I, for one, would like to rectify in my own mind. So let's all add Eleazar to the list of the great heroes of the Torah. Not great in that he accomplished great feats, but great because he was a faithful and dependable servant of God who did all that was asked of him and filled the office of high priest when his father was prevented from entering the land. The man who stood alongside Joshua and Caleb is one of only 4 named people from the previous generation who was in the land after the conquest has ended, the other being Eleazar's son Phinehas, who we're going to encounter once again before this book closes. Next to Eleazar is the usual focus of faithfulness in this story, Joshua and Caleb. And for the book that bears Joshua's name, it's good to see Caleb get several chapters here in the middle that tell of what happened to him. When the tribe of Judah comes to Joshua for their land allotment. Now just think about that word for a moment. Allotment of land chosen by Lot. Anyway, when Judah comes before Joshua for their allotment, it seems as if Caleb is the leader of Judah, and he approaches first, and he would be as the oldest member of the entire tribe. And when he comes before Joshua, he reminds him of the promise that Moses had made 40 years previous. What is interesting is how Caleb remembers the promise. Caleb states that Moses had said that the land on which your foot has trodden is your inheritance in verse 9. But there's no promise like this recounted in the book of Numbers. However, the promise does exist. It exists as Moses is recounting the history of Israel with God. We read this in chapter 1 of Deuteronomy, verse 35 through 36. Not one of these men of this evil generation shall see the good land that I swore to give to your fathers, except Caleb the son of Jephunneh, and he shall see it, and to him and to his children I will give the land on which he has trodden, because he has wholly followed the Lord. The land on which Caleb has trod will be his land. And so in Joshua 14, verse 12, Caleb says, "Give me this mountain which Adonai spoke in that day." You know the mountain. The one with the Anakim and the great walled cities? The one that the spies reported on as being too frightening so as to call the whole thing off? The fortress that still stands in Hebron that's not been conquered, even though Hebron was listed as conquered among the cities of the south that had been conquered in chapter 12. At the end of this chapter, we discover that Hebron was formerly named Kiriath-Arbah, or the city of Arba, and Arba is identified as the greatest of the Anakim. Now, we should take a moment to ask ourselves, who are the Anakim? Well, we read of the Anakim back in Numbers 13 when the spies returned from Canaan. Numbers 13, 32 through 33. So they brought the people of Israel a bad report of the land that they had spied out, saying, "The land through which we have gone to spy out is a land that devours its inhabitants, and all the people that we saw in it are of great height. And there we saw the Nephilim, sons of Anak, who come from the Nephilim. And we seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, and so we seemed to them." This is the evil report that was given by the spies. That land devours its inhabitants. The people are of great height. There are giants in this land, and they are the sons of Anak. And Anak is a descendant of the Nephilim. And the Nephilim, they're creatures of legend that were first introduced back in Genesis 6. Genesis 6, 1 through 4, when man began to multiply on the face of the land and daughters were born to them, the sons of God saw that the daughters of man were attractive, and they took as their wives any that they chose. Then the Lord said, "My spirit shall not abide in man forever, for he is flesh. His days shall be 120 years. The Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward, when the sons of God came into the daughters of man, and they bore children to them. These were the mighty men who were of old, the men of renown." Now, a lot of debate has happened over who the Nephilim were and what this passage actually means. And I covered the possibility years ago in this podcast in my lesson on Genesis 6, so I'm not going to retread that path. For now, let's just settle on the fact that they are called mighty men of old and men of renown. Both are titles that speak of great and powerful warriors. And regardless of just how tall the Anakim were, whether they were legitimate giants or simply very large and powerful humans, they were very large and powerful. And if they were giants, then it's all the better, because that makes Caleb and Joshua that much more impressive in their faith. And this episode reveals something else that is of great importance for us. Caleb had great faith. Caleb had great courage. And because of that, Caleb had a great reward. But Caleb isn't rewarded with the best city or the most bountiful city. He isn't rewarded according to human understanding of reward. Caleb is rewarded commensurate with his faith. He's given the biggest and the hardest fight to be found in Canaan. Their greatest warriors ensconced in a city with high walls. Caleb was given the task of taking the impregnable city. And it was this that Caleb asked for. He asked for Hebron. He sought the great fight. He knew that God would deliver, and he was ready to prove that with his life. In his zeal for the land that he had waited 45 years for, he jumps at the chance to prove the claim that he had made back in Numbers 13. And Caleb makes this statement as part of his appeal to be given the land that he was promised. "I am just as strong today in warfare as I was in the day that we scouted the land." But in his choice of this mountain, Caleb makes another clear statement. "I have just as much faith that God will deliver the enemy into my hands as I was that day so long ago." And in all of this, Caleb exhibits the courage that Joshua called for back in chapter 1. But when Caleb is given the city of Hebron, he's given more than just the hardest fight. He is also given the legacy of Abraham. Hebron is where Abraham lived for a great deal of his time in Canaan. Hebron is where Abraham, Sarah, Isaac, Rebekah, and potentially Rachel were buried in the cave of Machpelah. And when Jacob died in Genesis 50, all of Egypt took his body in a procession to the same cave so that he could be buried with his father. Caleb was not only given the toughest fight to gain his inheritance, he was also given the legacy of Israel to be his inheritance and the inheritance of his family. Now, this is profound when you consider once again that Caleb was a Gentile. Caleb is identified as a Kenizzite throughout the book of Numbers and will be again later here in the book of Joshua. His family was from the land of Canaan, and yet Caleb was one out of all of the scouts who had faith that God would carry through on his promises. Caleb was one of 2 men from the 12 tribes that were not Levi, who lived through the entire 40 years in the wilderness. Caleb was the one who was given the heritage of Abraham, while Joshua was given the role of Moses. And Caleb wasn't even a Hebrew. Now, he was a Jew. He represented the tribe of Judah, but he was not of the bloodline of Abraham. This simple fact proves the point that salvation is by faith. Inclusion into the promises is by faith, as Paul says in Galatians, and not by bloodline. And those of faith, they are the seed of Abraham. It has always been this way from the very beginning. The promise has always been the reward for those with faith. And this is significant because Joshua is a book of prophecy. The fact that a Gentile led the tribe of Judah and inherited the legacy of Abraham because of his faith is prophetic. This can be seen as a prophecy of the Messianic age. Gentiles grafted into Judah and given the lead to proceed in faith in order to claim the promise and the legacy that God had given to Abraham. But if we see it this way, we must be sure that we also don't see Gentiles as replacing the Jews. The Jews did not go away. It's simply that it was a Gentile that led the Jews at this point. He was grafted into them, not the other way around. And so are we. Romans 11:17-21 says, "But if some of the branches were broken off, and you, although a wild olive shoot, were grafted in among the others, and now share in the nourishing root of the olive tree, don't be arrogant towards the branches. If you are, remember it is not you who support the root, but the root that supports you. Then you will say, branches were broken off, that I might be grafted in." Well, that's true. They were broken off because of their unbelief. But you stand fast through faith. So do not become proud, but fear. For if God did not spare the natural branches, neither will he spare you. We as Gentiles, we are grafted into Israel. Israel is not grafted into Gentiles. We are wild branches. They are natural branches. He didn't cut down the olive tree. The tree still stands, and we should never take pride in the fact that we have been grafted in, because we can be cut off just as quickly and easily as the unbelieving branches were. We must shift our own identity to match Israel, just as Caleb came to represent Judah. He became Judah because of his faith. Now, if we turn and look at this from the view of inheriting the promises of God that are recounted in the New Testament, we find that there is a greater reward for continued faithfulness from the beginning. Matthew 25:29, "For everyone who has will be given, and he will have an abundance. But from the one who has not, even what he has will be taken away." Or Galatians 6:9, "And let us not grow weary of doing good, for in due season we will reap if we do not give up." But great faith and great faithfulness will result in a greater fight, not as punishment, but as part of that greater reward. Because if you truly have great faith, then you know that it's not your own power that will win the fight. But this is not a fight that we should run from. We do have to fight for our inheritance, and the greater the inheritance, the greater the fight. But with faith and courage, we can proceed forward in faith to claim that inheritance that God has prepared for us, according to our measure of faith. And in the end, the greatest reward that we will receive is life. So seek life in all that you do. Derish Chai. Shalom. Thank you for tuning in to Derish Chai. If this content has blessed you and you would like more, please consider subscribing, liking, commenting, and sharing with others. To find out more about what we do and to support this ministry, head over to seeklifesc.com. That's seeklifesc.com. We'll see you again next time as we Derish Chai, as we seek life. Shalom.